Welcome to Exploring Monterey Bay, airing bi-weekly on KSQD 90.7, 89.7, and 89.5 FM. I'm your host, Mathilde Rand, and my guest is Andrea van der Loo, author of The Pressing Stones, The Healing Journey of a Nazi's Daughter. Healing from the impact of war and clearing her being from the massive shadow of her father's past has been a major focus of her life. Our conversation will revolve around her childhood experiences and her strong connection with her father. We will review Andrea's reasons for writing the book. Andrea is originally from the Netherlands and has lived in Santa Cruz since 1979. Welcome, Andrea.
Well, thank you, Mathilde. It's really lovely to be here with you.
Andrea, you were born in 1942 in the Netherlands from a German mother and a Dutch father. Tell us a little bit more about that.
But they were both born and raised in Germany. So my father, even though his family was Dutch, he was also born and raised in Germany. So they were both seduced by the propaganda of pre-war Nazi Germany and became involved.
Did he believe in it?
Oh, yeah. Oh, he was an idealist. And I don't know how that propaganda went and how they presented their ideas so idealistically. But they swept up the nation, especially young people.
He was Dutch-speaking also, right?
He could speak Dutch, yeah, but he was really raised in Germany. So in a way, German was his first language. Yeah.
And so because he was Dutch-speaking, he was sent to the Netherlands?
And it so happened that my mother with my older brother, she had only one child at the time, was visiting my father's mother who was living in Holland. She had moved with her husband a few years before the war started because she had driven downtown for errands and came to a barricaded street in Münster in Germany. And she watched the rounding up of Jews. And she told the chauffeur to turn around, and she packed up her business, and she and her husband
went to the Netherlands.
They had never lived in Holland, even though they were Dutch. Yeah.
Interesting. But they were able to go back because they were Dutch.
Yeah, and they had money. My mother, with my older brother, actually went to visit them just before the war started. Of course, nobody knew that the war was going to start. And then she is there, and the war starts, and the borders close. It's the first thing that happens in war, apparently, that the borders close, so she couldn't go back. And then, since my father's family was already in Holland, and he was Dutch, he was sent into Holland as part of the occupation. Yeah, he started out as being a member of the Arbeidsdienst. It's the workers' service. And he became the commander of a camp where Dutch young men had been rounded up to become part of the war machine. That's what he did in the beginning.
The war lasted a couple of years. And then close to the end of the war, in September of 1944, what happened?
So in the meantime, my father had become a member of the SS to save his own hide, actually. It's all in the book. There's so many stories. My father had received intelligence that the Dutch were planning a major uprising the next day. So that night, thousands of Dutch people who had been sympathizers, collaborators, whatever, had to flee the Netherlands into Germany. At that time, I am born and I have a little sister. So my mother with 3 little children, we have to get on a train and we drive through the night to Berlin. To drive through the night because in daytime it would be a target for bombing. So that's how we ended up
in Berlin. How was that train ride?
I was 2. I do not remember really. I have body memory of cold, hungry, frightened. Everybody was afraid. So it was a scary ride. And it took very long. It took a couple or maybe even 3 nights to get to Berlin, which is not a very long distance from Holland.
Right. So you were all in Berlin, and then your father...
He went to the SS headquarters because he belonged to the SS already. So that's where he had to go. There he received training, which it's hard to imagine what that was like, to be trained by the SS. And he was sent back into Holland just like a month before the end of the war.
For what reason?
to undermine the Dutch resistance. That was their mission. It was crazy because as they were in front of the border, they stayed there for a little while. They saw the German troops straggling over the border back into Germany because everybody knew the war was ending. There was no more winning in the picture. And we went again upstream, as it were, against that movement. And my mother, strangely enough, decided to go back into war zone with her three little children. She couldn't imagine not being close to my father, although, of course, she wouldn't be close to him because he had to go do his thing. And so we were taken to the north of Holland. My father brought us there. And at that time, all the collaborators that were living in Holland, they were scrambling for safety in numbers. So they had found a large estate where they all gathered. And then when the war ended, the farmers and farmhands around the place came in and took us all prisoner. So we became a makeshift post-war Dutch camp that wasn't even known by the government. It was a completely spontaneous thing that happened from the Dutch people around that place, who were, of course, furious with anything to do with the Germans because they had just been through the hunger winter. They had had absolute horrendous time, and they were furious, and we were the recipients of that.
What happened to your little sister?
Yeah, my baby sister, she was only 10 months old, and she had already stopped thriving with the whole fleeing and everything, and she died. And unfortunately, the women around my mother suggested that my brother and I shouldn't see the baby. So the other children in the camp were all allowed to bring flowers and put around her little body, and we were not. So we didn't know, we weren't told anything. And then the next morning I have my first terrifying memory where I'm standing in a courtyard. We are all standing in a courtyard. All I'm seeing is these dingy skirts and brown stockings of women in front of me, and a very angry voice from way in front. I can't see the person. He's shouting something. And I have just turned 3, actually. It's about a week after my 3rd birthday. And I know something is wrong with us. And everybody seems to be afraid. There's something wrong with our family. I don't know what it is, but I am afraid for our life. That is how terrified I am. And he keeps shouting, and then it comes closer and closer. It comes to us, and all of a sudden he calls something, and there's silence. And I just freeze. And then a woman somewhere in the crowd says something, I don't know what. I'm 3. I don't understand what's going on. And the whole thing passes. Then everybody goes inside. Nobody ever knew how frightened I was. So there was this strange oblivion after this terrifying experience that led to nothing. I carried that memory for a very long time in my life. I was in my 50s, I think, when I visited my brother and we spent time together. That's when the first time I ever told anyone that memory I had.
Amazing.
I had never asked my mother, because my mother would never speak of anything meaningful to do with the war, nothing. We were just fine. When we finally had a home and we were together, we were now supposed to be happy and fine.
So you didn't stay at the camp, right? You went...
No, I don't really know how long I was there, but my grandmother actually volunteered, apparently, to take the children. So then we were put on a train to go to my grandmother's house.
Wow.
Yeah. And then we waited there, and eventually my mother came.
But your father was not in the picture.
My father was out of the picture. I don't know when people found out that my father had been taken prisoner, but probably right as the war ended, is my guess. And so he was in Scheveningen in the prison. And there he went to the International Court in The Hague, and there he was sentenced to death for war crimes. And these war crimes were all committed in those last 3 weeks, where he was crazy because there were these rumors that the Dutch were murderous at the time, that they may have already killed his wife and his children.
Oh, gosh.
Of course, there's no communication, there are no cell phones at this time. So my father was not in his right mind at all. And they did have prisoners. And we now see, we get it in the news finally, that when prisoners are taken, they're tortured. That's what happens everywhere. Every country goes to war, they take prisoners, they get tortured. And so that's what he did. And so he did commit war crimes.
Tell me a little bit more about your grandmother.
So I'm born in her house. Of course, she was furious with my father. He wasn't allowed to come visit in the daytime because he refused to not come in uniform. He was way too proud. He was very proud of being a part of this massive, superior, great system of Germany. It's like when I get the heebies when I hear people in this country talk about this country needing to be the greatest. You know, it's like, oh, please don't. It is just a terrible thing to go there. And we see it in this country too. What happens, people get seduced into this fantasy of we are the greatest.
And she didn't like it. Good for her.
Well, she was Dutch. She didn't want to have anything to do with them.
No, she had her own problems, right? She was an alcoholic.
Yeah, she was an alcoholic, although we lived there for a while. She was very nice to me. I didn't notice. I mean, she always had a little shot glass next to her. But she didn't behave like an alcoholic, that I could tell. But when I came back to her, what happened, she was quite heavy. She had in Africa, when they lived in Africa, she had gotten elephantiasis. So where the legs go straight down to the ground, you have no ankles. So sometimes I would see under her long skirts her big elephant feet.
Wow. So you live with your grandmother. We're going to talk a little bit more after having told our listeners that this is Exploring Monterey Bay. I'm Mathilde Rand, your host, and my guest is Andrea van der Loo, who is the author of The Pressing Stones, The Healing Journey of a Nazi's Daughter. And we just talked about the situation during the war. Mm-hmm. And so after the war, you were, World War II, you were at your grandmother's house. Your mother came back and then they decided to send you to boarding school?
Yeah. Well, my grandmother had raised 7 children. We didn't have a home. We had nothing. So my mother she became a doula. She had to go to school, to classes, and then she had to work. And they just decided together that it was best for us to go to be living in a Catholic boarding school. So we were taken to a very backward Catholic boarding school in the south of Holland. We were charity cases because my mother didn't have any resources. And these nuns knew exactly why we were there because in the newspapers, the court case was all over the newspapers. And so they knew who my father was. And so my brother was lucky. He was taken under the wings of the one really nice nun that was there. And also the boys and girls were completely kept separate. So I'm sure my mother thought that at least we would have each other. But we never saw each other. I only saw him because he was an altar boy when there was Mass and he would be in front by the altar. But on my side, I was hated. It was very clear to me that these nuns, they looked at me as if I was the daughter of scum in their eyes.
Yeah.
And that's how I was treated. It was very difficult.
But your mother, when she sent you to boarding school, she dropped you off.
Yeah.
She told you not to tell?
What happened after some time, so she would come every few weeks when she had space, she would come on a Sunday afternoon and visit my brother and me. So that's when we would be, the 3 of us, together for a few hours. And then she had to leave again. And so one day when she came, just before we had to go back into the school, so interesting that she probably waited till she had to tell us, because it was a very difficult thing for her to do. So she looks at us very seriously. She takes my little face in her hand under my chin and lifts my face up to her. And I look into her very serious eyes, and she tells, I have to tell you something very difficult. Your father has been sentenced to death. I believe he's innocent. And there's only one thing you can do. You can pray for him. And I'm shattered. My country, my people, I am Dutch. I'm completely Dutch identified. My country wants to kill my father. It's beyond anything I can deal with. Mm-hmm. And then she says, you cannot tell anyone. And so already I felt really isolated there because of how I was treated. And I didn't relate to anybody. I didn't relate to the kids either. Now I am so isolated. We walk back into the boarding school, and then all I do is pray. Pray my little head off to save my father's life.
Now, when you were 12, you went back to your grandma's house?
No. My grandmother had died in the meantime.
Oh.
Yeah, so my mother actually managed to to have a small basement, like a half of a basement, underneath the house of a friend of hers in Rotterdam, and where she and I could live. My father at the time, he was released with the condition that he would stay in a mental hospital for a year before actually moving home. They wanted him to be under psychiatric care because he was released on the premise that he was not, by psychiatric evaluation, that he was not in his right mind at the end of the war. And they wanted to make sure that he was ready to be back with family. So when he came, his younger sister was living in Rotterdam, and they managed to get us an apartment. And then we had a home to ourselves. It was so amazing. This is a thing I'd been praying for my whole childhood, like a home for ourselves.
So you got your dad back.
I got my dad back, and being back with the family and having a place to be.
You were 7 years in the boarding school. Did you get any
Yes.
help, psychological help yourself?
No, that wasn't available then. There was nothing of the kind. I just had to behave, be quiet, stand still. One time in kindergarten, I went there when I was 5. I don't know, I must have been talking with the girls next to me. The nun gets so angry, and she hollers at me, and she grabs me, and she puts me in a closet. It was a broom closet, so it was a very dusty, small, dinky little place. She closes the door, and she says, "Don't let me ever hear you again." And then, after a while, I hear the bell rings, and I hear the chairs moving, and everybody leaves. And I'm in the closet, and I'm completely forgotten. And that's when, thank God, after a little while, I hear this nun with my brother coming through the hallway, and I shout at them. I don't know what I said, help. And I could hear her rushing over to me. She opened the door, and she was so shocked. She was very kind to me. She said, "Who did that to you?" And she just sent me off to my lunch, and that was that.
Tell me a little bit about when your dad came home.
Actually, before we lived together, he was allowed to come and visit. He had already been released. Grown-ups in those days were just so crazy. They didn't know what children needed. So my mother tells my brother and me, we are in a home of a friend of hers where she's temporarily staying. And she says, "Your uncle is coming to visit, my father's older brother." Okay. So the bell rings. We are on the 3rd floor. So in the Holland, you have these long, steep flights of stairs. So she presses this buzzer to open the door. We look down the flight of stairs, and who should be there but my father? It was so crazy. So my father comes up. We're all like tumbling all over each other, and this incredible joy, that here's my father. Here's this man we have all been wanting back with us.
He and you talked a lot, and he
So
shared
when we
things.
lived together, he was crazy about me. Really, my mother loved me. I knew that. My father really, really loved me. And so after dinner, he would sit down and start talking with me. He was talking at me, which I didn't realize at the time. I am too young. But he's talking about spirituality and sexuality and all of their adventures, my mother's and father's sexual adventures. It was a little crazy. Much, much later, I realized I called it psychic incest, because he crossed all my boundaries verbally, not engaging me, just talking about what people loved. And his motivation was that I would not marry a man, and he would have to go to prostitutes to get his needs met. That was his crazy thinking. That was also their experience.
So there you are.
There I am.
Suffering from war, getting...
And now having to be happy and being happy.
And then having to hear all of this
Having to hear all of that. And then all
And you're only 12, 13, 14 years old.
So when I'm 13, I don't know where babies come from. And I'm 14. I know everything under the sun about every kink there is. Yeah, it was not good.
Then at some point you left your house and traveled the world, studied psychology.
In Amsterdam,
and, Yeah, and then you got some psychedelic healing sessions from a shaman.
After quite a long time living in Oroville in India, where we had some really amazing experiences.
Part of your healing. And
Part
then
of my healing.
And that was all in your 50s when you had the psychedelic healing process. And the shaman says to you, there is a secret.
He's offering me an LSD session, therapeutic session. And I'm in a deep space, and all of a sudden I notice he is pacing. So I became aware that Harara had been pacing the floor for a while.
So you're reading right now from your book?
I'm reading from my book.
Perfect.
Suddenly he stopped in his tracks and declared, "You have a secret." "Oh no," I groaned. Not that, I knew. There's only one big ugly secret. It is clear to me that I am at a point of no return and agree to take the plunge into the abyss of my subconscious. It seems I drop out of time and space. Everything becomes profoundly still. Slowly my right shoulder lifts off the bed as if moved by some involuntary force. Something is hidden behind my back. As my upper body lifts up, I look behind me and gasp. I see a mass grave with white corpses. The Holocaust. My terrifying guilt exposed. I reel with the impact. Harara's right there holding the space for me, unflappable. After a little while I move to sit in front of him, facing him. I look into his face and see a great wizard. Goodness seemed engraved in the very texture of his face. Just present, strong, kind, and exceedingly skillful. In his gaze, I understand the error of my child's mind. I hadn't been able to differentiate myself from my father, nor could I differentiate his war crimes from the mass murder of 6 million Jews. The horrifying images of the concentration camps I saw in the newsreel when I was 12 had blended seamlessly in my young psyche with the inextricable bond of love for my father, who had participated in that monstrous system. In my confusion, subconsciously, I had instantly felt guilty by association.
That is such a powerful expression of
and
your
that's the beginning of me coming out of my dissociated emotional state. Because I really, until then, I had been emotionally dissociated because I didn't know what to do with myself.
Now, did you and your dad ever talk about what happened during the war?
Yes. Yes, he did tell me. And whatever he told me is all in the book.
Okay.
And yes, he did.
Okay. And so you figured out what war crime he committed?
Oh, yeah. I read the whole court case, got all the papers. I read the whole thing. It was horrendous. After his death, decades after his death, I received a letter from him that was channeled by a Dutch woman, where he expresses his incredible grief that he had harmed me and all his loved ones, put us in an impossible situation because we loved him, and how can you integrate that with the crimes that he had committed? And then he also really wanted to talk to people about beware of the seduction of powerful leaders.
And that's why you wrote the book.
That's why I actually wrote the book. Because when this country went to war in 2003, and I saw Americans waving their flags, I went, oh my God, don't you know what it's like to wage war? And that's what we do.
I know we ran out of time. Thank you so much, Andrea. Listeners, this was Exploring Monterey Bay with Andrea van der Loo, author of Depressing Stones, The Healing Journey of a Nazi's Daughter. For more information, please visit her website, Depressing Stones, all one word, depressingstones.com. Andrea, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much.
You gave me a lot to think about.
I am very moved.